Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about the disciplinary boundaries of design education. In this week's episode, I am joined by Mike Essl. Mike is the Dean and Associate Professor in the School of Art at Cooper Union here in New York. After graduating from Cooper with a focus in graphic design, he helped start the New York design studio, The Chopping Block. He received his MFA from Cranbrook, all the while continuing to teach at Cooper, eventually becoming the Dean in 2017. I've known Mike for a few years now, and to me, he's so intimately connected to Cooper Union. And in my head, it's always been hard for me to wrap my head around where Cooper fits into the spectrum of design education and kind of, placing them in the type of students that they produce. And so that's where we begin this conversation. We talk about the structure of the Cooper Union program, why they don't have majors, the value of interdisciplinary critique, and how his time there as a student changed his life. We also talk more generally about design education and the importance of teaching process and ways of thinking, as well as the future of design and how we can prepare the next generation of design students for this uncertain future. As you'll see, Mike's love for Cooper Union is truly infectious. For just a sample of that, I encourage you to watch a talk he gave a few years ago about Cooper Union. It's called Same Bat Time, Same Bat Channel. I put a link to it in the show notes. But my hope is that some of that enthusiasm comes through here as well and shows the strange and wonderful history of this unique school and what we can learn from it as well. If you like the show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. They give you access to all sorts of bonus content, like a monthly newsletter. You can get episodes early. You can get full transcripts of every episode, as well as exclusive interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. Scratching the Surface is completely supported by these memberships. So if you like the show and if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surface podcast for all the details and to sign up. Thanks for listening. And here is my conversation with Mike Essl. I want to start this conversation with possibly a big question and possibly a weird question to start. And
okay,
this maybe says something more about me than anything else. But when I think about you, you are kind of synonymous with Cooper Union to me. I mean, you've been there essentially your whole career since undergrad. You do have it tattooed on your chest. And when I think about Cooper Union, I think about this it's hard for me to kind of wrap my head around what Cooper Union is, and specifically graphic design in Cooper Union.
Yeah.
It's easy for me to kind of reduce it to Pushpin Studio vibe, like that, very New York, Milton Glaser, Seymour Quast, but it's not just that. And I studied with Ellen Lupton. I know Abbott. I know all of these people, but it's always been hard for me to kind of define it, especially in relationship to other design schools. How do you think about graphic design in Cooper Union, I guess, is the question that I'm trying to ask.
Sure. I get this question a lot because I only graduate between 6 and 8 graphic designers a year. And many of them go on to, be recognized in the profession. So, if you look at the size of our graduating class and then the people you just mentioned, Ellen and Abbott and Milton and Seymour, but then there's also, Emily Oberman is at Pentagram. Right. And there's many more out there. And I think one thing is just the size. We're small. It's very intimate. It's a little bit of a different approach than other art schools. But I think it's also that we don't have a major at Cooper Union. So there's no majors. You don't really major in design when you study design there. You take a series of design classes, but you can easily complement those with fine art classes. Mm. And I think what happens that I've seen in art critiques I've been a guest critic almost everywhere at this point, if you're in a design critique and there's somebody who maybe his practice is primarily rooted in, say, painting, and then they're in your design class, right? They're going to bring the critique a whole other level of nuance that might not come from a room of just graphic designers.
Right.
And that mix at all levels at Cooper Union and across disciplines, I think, is what accounts for the difference in our strategy, which is that we don't really teach graphic design like it's a major. We teach it as a tactic inside a larger fine art idea. So, when I bring in adjuncts to teach at Cooper, I will often say that you'd be better off assigning the vessel for students to pour content in than assigning the content, because it's that approach is much more applied. And it's not it's not that I'm so naive to think that the business and the industry of graphic design is not going to enter the classroom. I just think we can do that in ways that are more interesting than just, say, faux client work and things like that.
Right. And I agree with. I like that model. I'm a fan of that, and I'm generally kind of a fan of even, just even getting rid of these disciplinary boundaries in general.
There's a lot of talk about that at Cooper Union, about what are these disciplines and how have they lasted so long.
Can you talk about that? Because I'm curious about. I like this idea as you're talking about it, but I'm curious what it actually looks like. So, are there students graduate with a BFA, and then
just a straight BFA? Yep.
And so they could have a focus that's in graphic design, but it could also be like painting or sculpture or any, and then they can just take classes across, any of these things.
Basically the spread it's based just on prereqs after the first year. So the first year set, everybody does the same foundation year. And then from the sophomore period on, you're basically in charge of negotiating your program and figuring out what's interesting to you. And then we help you stack up the prerequisites to get there, basically. So the other thing I'll add is that, unlike other schools, we actually discourage concentration. So if you're a sophomore and say you wanted to take 3 graphic design studios, we wouldn't let you. We'd only let you take 2.
Do you have... I'm going to ask you this question in 2 ways. One,
Sure.
Generally, and then about you specifically. Do you have students who come into the school like wanting to be a graphic designer and push up against that kind of idea, or are you kind of getting students who know what they're getting into? And then the kind of secondary question that I'm asking is what that was like for you. You gave this great talk a couple years ago that I saw called Same Bat Place, Same Bat Channel, which is kind of about your story, but it's also a kind of history of Cooper. And you seemed like somebody who had a very clear interest in graphic design going into it. What was that experience like for you to kind of, bounce around like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. When I came in 92, it was pretty alien to say I want to be a graphic designer at school. We had people who were interested in it, but that was, in a way, all I was interested in. So it was a little problematic for me in that when they told me I couldn't take 3 graphic design classes in my sophomore year, I ended up taking silkscreen and sculpture. And in the end, I mean, look, taking silkscreen, designers should probably be required to take that, in my opinion, just in terms of understanding separations and ink. And I mean, if you're going to do print, it's kind of a key learning process. So they knew what was good for me, even though I did not. Right. So occasionally we'll have a student who's hyper focused in one area. It's not always design. Most people at Cooper Union find design. They like maybe enjoyed it the first year, took the second year classes, and then stuck with it. But it would be pretty rare to find a graduate who by their senior year was only doing graphic design. I felt a little bit like a misfit, but it also, in the end, it's like my concentration on graphic design really paid off because I was already freelancing before I graduated.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about when you have kind of new adjuncts come in and you tell them to assign the vessel instead of the content. Which I love that idea. And I don't mean to make this into this whole conversation will not be telling me about the curriculum of
no, I get that. That's fine.
Cooper Union, but something that I think about in the classes that I teach that are in graphic design departments that are a little bit more rigid than what you're talking about. I'm always finding myself trying to push the boundaries of what a graphic design project is, how abstract I can make it. I definitely have had students who do things and they're like, is this design? I feel like I'm making art. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like, you're doing the project. But then they're asking questions like, well, how am I going to get a job?
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar approach.
Can you
Yeah.
talk about like how, like, that's what I want to know is like how you do that. And then when you have students, if you have students who are like, is this going to get me a job? Like, teach me the things I need to know so I can then go work as a designer. How do you do that balance between like exploration, about thinking about form, thinking about expanding these kind of definitions and boundaries with that kind of pressure of, I also know that I need to get a job after this?
I mean, part of keeping the vessel, designing the vessel of the project and not the content, is that if the student wants to turn it into like a more applied portfolio piece, they can, and you can even
Mm.
encourage them to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can when you offer a project like that, if you see a student who, say, maybe just isn't ready for their own idea in that way, right? That
Mm-hmm.
you would maybe lead them to something more applied, because often that's what I think draws students to design in undergrad, is that it doesn't have the it doesn't appear to have the wild landscape of a fine arts degree, right?
Yeah,
But it
yeah.
really does. It's, in a way, there isn't much separation. It's just some students have a preconceived notion of, it has to be applied for me to get a job.
Right,
And
right.
what I've learned is, it's not so much like the work shows your talent, it shows the dedication, right? But the conversation about the work is what gets you the job.
Right.
And I think if the students who have made their own projects in my classes can actually speak about them in intelligent ways and show that they directed that project to conclusion, right? That I think would hold the same weight as like a fake redesign of the Exxon logo.
Right. Right. That's a project I've never given.
Good.
Nor have I ever been given that project when I was a student either.
When
But
when
that's
I
a
was at when I was at Cooper, I got a project from I think it was from Barbara Glauber, it was an identity class, which is maybe the most applied, right?
mhm, yeah.
And even in that class, the way she taught it was, like, identify yourself within a cultural group,
Mhm,
research that cultural group and any sort of visual signals or visual coding do they use as to indicate they're a member of that group, right?
right. Right.
And then create a system of parts to communicate about that group, right?
Hmm.
So I could have turned that as, I'm part of X corporation and this is my identity, right? Or I could have done it about the weird ecosystem of all my roommates,
Right.
and both in critique in that moment had equal weight. And I think maybe that's the trick, is that you make projects that can do both,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you help the students find their voice within those projects, I think.
Yeah. How does that happen in critique? Like when you have these projects where students are thinking both kind of personally and, in kind of more applied projects, and questions around good and bad. And this is like good graphic design or sellable graphic design or whatever, no longer work, like those kind of old ways, the way that like I was critiqued in school, the way that perhaps,
Yeah,
you
I
were.
had crits like that. I walked out of a few of them, but I had crits like that.
Well, you're a braver person than I was in school. How does that change the like critique model and the critique conversation? Because it sounds like the critiques then are the way to have the conversations about the work, which you're also saying are kind of like equally as important in these situations.
My critique style is I don't let the students preface the work with any kind of preamble before we critique it.
Mm, hmm.
So they have to, I mean, the words I use often is like, I'm sorry, but you just have to suffer in silence while we talk about this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And the
yeah.
idea is for me, is that you brought up this, like, is graphic design art? Or that's often a question in critique. And for me, there needs to be utility for it to transcend, or needs to have a utility, deliver some utility, or deliver some communication for it to be graphic design, right? So as they're suffering in silence, we're interpreting, right? And then when we have our say, then I open the floor to the designer who made the piece, and they talk about, they react to what they heard, and then they have to, in a way, evaluate were my goals achieved or not, right? And that's what we talk about. And a little bit of that is about intent, like what was your intent with the piece? What are your motives behind making it? And then we talk as a class together then about sort of the coming together of the notions from critique and the notions that motivated the piece. And then I generally try to have a follow-up conversation one-on-one in which I just help them figure out what notes to apply and which ones maybe are not in service of the piece.
This is going to be a kind of roundabout way, but it's exactly connecting to what you're just talking about. You mentioned earlier that while you were still in school, you had freelance clients, you were kind of starting to do design, and then right after you graduated, you started a studio with some friends, right? Was that right away?
Yeah, right away. I mean, I took a job at Cooper Union as an in-house designer for a few months.
Okay.
Basically to keep my freelance alive. And then when the freelance overtook the time I needed to have a job, I quit the job.
Okay, nice. And then, so you were doing that, you had this kind of short job, but then you were doing this freelance work. This turned into a studio. But then in like 3 or 4 years, you went to Cranbrook for an MFA, which as I was preparing for this and thinking about this conversation, I was thinking there's actually some interesting similarities between Cooper and Cranbrook, in that, at least for me, I think of both of them as sort of the kind of punk rock schools in design. They're like a little bit of the outsider. They do things a little bit different than everybody else. Why did you want to go back to school? Why did you want an MFA, and why Cranbrook?
Big questions. So it's funny. So I started the chopping block with my friends right out of undergrad, and because the internet had just sort of become a thing, we're talking 1995, 1996, around that. I won't say it was easy to start a design firm, but it felt easy to me.
Right.
And we have this legacy at Cooper Union of, like, not only did Pushpin go out and start a studio, but, when I was a student, IO 360 went out and started a studio. And I'm still friendly with Casey Reese, who worked there, so Casey didn't go to Cooper, but that legacy is there. There were Cooper founding partners. And so when I graduated, I was like, well, why would I want to go work for somebody else? It doesn't make any sense to me. So we started the firm, and in the beginning, it was just 2 of us, 2 Cooper grads. And then we added 2 more Cooper grads as partners. And then we grew it to about 20 people with some interns. We had a whole floor of a building in Chelsea. It was really kind of insane. And I'll tell you, I hated every minute of it.
What did you hate about it?
I love making design. I don't so much love being beholden to my clients.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, we had a niche that was mainly entertainment sites. And although I'm skilled at delivering that kind of work, like if you tell me make it cooler, I could figure out I'll make it cooler. It's just like, this is the thing I can do. So that work, it just wasn't as fulfilling as I had imagined it to be. So I started thinking about my options, and, we were pretty successful at the time. So going to graduate school financially was probably the dumbest thing I could have done. But I needed a break, like right after undergrad. We did all that work. It was very fast paced. So the company kept going while I was at graduate school. I basically took a sabbatical.
Oh, wow.
I was the only grad student I knew that was getting profit sharing while they were in graduate school.
Yeah.
And the why Cranbrook question is a good one, because you're right. There are similarities. And in graphic design, at least let's say in print design, there's often this idea of the big 3, like there's Yale, Cal Arts, and Cranbrook. That's more of a legacy, I think, of the criticism, the writing of around design in the 90s,
Yeah. I agree.
But for me, those were the only 3 options. So
okay.
I did not apply to Yale because all my professors went to Yale. And I figured I already got that somehow. You know what I mean? Like that philosophy already entered into my classrooms. And so for me, it was down to Cal Arts or Cranbrook. And My first interview was at CalArts, and I loved it. All the people I met were really great. I thought the program was fantastic. And then as I sat with it a little bit, I realized every professor there that I resonated with went to Cranbrook. And I was like,
Right,
do
right.
I want to study under them or be them? And for me, Cranbrook was better because Cooper Union's very intense and Cranbrook has no classes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Cooper, the Cooper model really, it gave me, I don't know, the ability to be very self-directed, right? So going to Cranbrook where they rely on you to be self-directed was really perfect for me. My timing going to grad school was a little odd because it was run by a husband and wife team, P. Scott
Yeah.
Makela and Lori Makela, and I was a huge fan of Scott Makela's work, just
Yeah.
a huge fan. And so my plan was to study under him, and unfortunately, he passed away right before I got there.
Okay, I
Um,
was going to ask about that timing. I was trying to figure it out, and I couldn't figure out if it was right after or right before. It was right before you got
yeah,
there.
so I met him for my interview, and we talked, and I got in, and we had a hilarious conversation. And then, through some really freak kind of moment, he, got an infection and died. Which just meant that the 2 years after were rocky for Lori, which made the department a little, it was a little rocky. But she did her
Hmm.
best, man. I had no hard feelings. It was just an odd time.
Yeah.
Um,
So she then continued to run the department up until you graduated, right? It was like the same year that
yeah,
she left too.
correct. And then they did a search, and I was there when they did the search, and then they brought in Elliot Earls, who's still running the
Okay.
program.
Right. Right.
And then I came back to chopping block after I graduated, and September 11th happened, and they had a meeting and laid me off from my own company.
Okay.
Which,
I had.
in the end was fine because I was already teaching and I really wanted to concentrate on teaching, and they knew I wasn't happy. So I mean, I was a partner, so they had to buy me out, so it wasn't all bad.
Yeah. Okay, I was, I had a follow up question, and then you like now I, like, this conversation just went in a different direction because the question that I was gonna ask was, how do you finish Cranbrook and then go back to what you were doing? Like, what was that like? But it sounds like
It was
that
a
actually
bad
was
idea. That's what that was like. And
we don't have to get into
no,
that.
of course not. And the legacy of my old company, like the chopping block, which was, very playful, energetic work,
Hmm.
is now one of my partners has a firm called One Trick Pony that works out of Philadelphia, and they do very amazing work.
You mentioned earlier that you hated kind of doing that work. You did not like being beholden to clients. I had read another interview with you in preparing for this where you mentioned um, kind of feeling when you started teaching, feeling like that was actually the thing that got you excited about this stuff. Was that and that resonated with me a lot as somebody again who wanted to be a graphic designer since I was a teenager and then finished school and got a job as a graphic designer and was like, wait a minute, something something's not quite right here. And then I worked for a little bit longer than you did and then went back to grad school, same thing. And for me, teaching also was a way to kind of find what it was that excited me about a lot of this stuff. Like teaching felt like a much more natural fit. What was what was it about teaching that kind of immediately caught you in a way that kind of client work didn't?
I think there's this moment where you see the student understand, right?
Yeah.
Where they have this epiphany of like, oh, that's why we space out uppercase type. That's a minor example. Or that you give them these real tools, right, to go out in the world with. And for me, design is like, I love making images, right? I just love the act of making them so much that teaching that part of it, right,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
practicing part will always be a thrill for me, always. um and there are ways to have a practice where you route around that kind of client work.
Hmm.
It's harder, right? But
Hmm.
you can do it, and that's what I've done. I mean, I do mostly book design now, for turns out, for very large corporations. But what I love about that is that it's slower than web design. It's a little more deliberate. The teamwork is a little more collaborative, in my opinion. It was a good switch for me that helped me with the teaching. And what you said is right, is that teaching every semester renewed my love for design, because seeing what the students do with the tools and the things we talk about, and then go out in the world and have success and pay their rent, with those tools, for me is always more fulfilling than, say, launching a website for Macy's.
Right.
That's all.
Right.
And no slight on designers who are fulfilled by that work, because everybody's doing a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
But for me, like my teachers changed my life. That kind of dedication, I don't know where I'd be without that. And the full scholarship to Cooper Union really tilted me towards really wanting to help people. So it's like, for me, design is like, if I can see that I'm helping somebody on the other side of the work, then I'm committed. I'll do it. But I never have to ask that question when I'm teaching.
Do you see is teaching for you a type of design? You mentioned, the reason I asked that question, I'm sorry to like hedge on this question,
Mm-hmm.
but you said something very early that I wanted to come back to, where you said that there was turned out that focusing on graphic design benefited you a lot in your career.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want to talk about that and dig into that a little bit more. And I'm curious kind of how you see, what's the kind of relationship or intersection between kind of design processes, the things that a graphic design student learns, and then being in the classroom and being a teacher.
I mean, if it was all training, right? If it was all like, here's how to set type in Illustrator, Photoshop, whatever, it would be almost, if it was all vocational, right? There'd be, in my opinion, there'd be no reason to do it anymore, because YouTube's better at that than I am.
Right. This is maybe a very like personal question coming from me as somebody who wanted to be a designer forever, and then started doing it and was like, is this right? And then kind of like finding teaching and writing and this podcast and like all this other stuff that's around design, that like you has made me like it again. But then there, whether that is insecurity or some existential question of like, oh, but like, am I like, I still identify as a designer, even though doing graphic design work in the very traditional sense is actually a very small percentage of what I do every day.
Interesting.
I still identify as a designer primarily, and because I'm in this world and all of that. I'm kind of curious how you think about that.
I mean, where I struggle is that I definitely, I don't know if I would have been excited about design as a kid if I knew it was so service related, right?
Yeah.
Like, on occasion, I really do feel like a digital janitor. I feel like the assets that arrive from some of these jobs are troublesome and make the job not work. They take my life out of it. You know what I mean? That kind of work. But what I struggled with was like, am I going to really teach something to somebody that makes me miserable? And what I realized is like, that's not fair, right? Like, it's not so much the whole thing makes me miserable, just certain pockets of it make me miserable. And if I can concentrate on the things that I get really excited about and help my students navigate those miserable things, right? Then I'm doing service, right? That's my service back to graphic design,
Yeah. Is there a, how do those, because it's interesting, and I want to talk about you being the dean in a second also,
Okay.
and how that kind of fits into all of this. But is there what's the back and forth like for you between, it's interesting that you're still doing client work and you're working on these books. How does that work kind of then make its way into the classroom, and then how does stuff that you're working with students then change how you're thinking about working with clients? How are those influencing each other?
I mean, the easy answer on the student side is how it influences me is that working with them has just made my thinking more broad, and it's exposed me to many more designers in the world, many more, because they go out and find all this work I've never ever seen before and probably would have never seen, right? So in terms of like my bubble, right, what the students give me is, man, they give me life. And I don't want to seem like some kind of energy vampire, right? But they what they give me is a perspective I would never have on my own in my work.
Yeah.
Right. And then
Yeah.
for me, it's the other side is like, if the question is why or how do I keep my practice alive, is the first answer is barely as dean. I think I've completed 2 books since I was dean, and I usually did about 3 a season, and I've been dean for 5 years, man.
Okay.
So it's been quite a slowdown, which is a choice I made because the Cooper Union is really important to me.
Yeah.
But I also, just a funny aside, is that I started making these collages on the side on Instagram because I didn't have a practice and I really just need to be doing design all the time. And now that's turned into a book deal. So
Oh,
you never know how these things are going to come back to
yeah.
you, you know?
That's interesting. And that leads into exactly what my kind of next question
Mm-hmm.
was going to be. You've been dean since 2017.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Acting dean a little bit earlier than that, but
Yeah,
it
for
kind of
about a
officially
year.
dean
Yep.
in 2017, and that came after. And we don't have to kind of go through this whole
Yeah.
story. I think like you've talked about it, like this, like the school was free for all these years, and then the president and leadership kind of built a building, all this money, and then it wasn't free, and you and a group of people sued the school, and all of this, and long story short, a bunch of changes. You're on the path to being free again.
Yep.
And somehow in all of that you became the dean. Is that a fair? I know
Yeah,
I
no,
summarized
that's
that,
a
but does
pretty
that?
good abridged version of it. I mean, look, the trustees and the president at the time decided for the first time in 150 years that Cooper Union should charge tuition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So me and some friends, we sued in New York Supreme Court. The end result of that is that that president left. We brought in a new president, and now we're on our path back to free. And what happened is I thought we were going to lose our lawsuit, so I moved to San Francisco because I didn't really want to teach
Mm-hmm.
anywhere but Cooper Union, really.
Yeah.
So I moved to San Francisco, worked on the lawsuit. Towards the end of all the calls about the lawsuit, it became pretty clear to me that we were going to win.
Mm.
And I got a call at the time from the current dean of the art school, who I could tell was indirectly asking what was going on. And when I conveyed to her that I thought we were going to win, she sort of indirectly told me she was maybe going to step down if everything was going to be fine.
I
And
see.
in that moment, I looked at my wife when I got off the phone and I was like, I think I'm going to be the dean. And, there was disbelief there. And
Yeah.
what happened is I returned to Cooper Union. I taught for 1 year. The dean did, in fact, step down because, it was just the right time for transition. And
Yeah.
I put my hand up to be acting dean because that's the tradition at Cooper Union is a faculty member steps up between deans.
Okay.
And then I ended up doing well enough that they appointed me the real dean, which is the joke I make is going from acting to real, like I'm Pinocchio or something.
Right.
And then now I did 3 years, and now I'm about to start another 3-year term as dean.
First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
And it does seem, as somebody who was following all of that, kind of in real time, just out of interest, it's been exciting to actually watch it, go the way that it's supposed to go,
Yeah,
uh,
true. Yep.
when it so easily couldn't have. But I'm curious about you being the dean, especially in the context of this conversation, as somebody who loves making images, loves being in the classroom, and you're still kind of maintaining a practice. You've continued to teach, but how does all this like admin stuff, that comes with dean, how does that fit into this? Do you enjoy that also?
Huh. It's like I have to factor who might be listening to this.
Right. I mean, I don't mean it like that, but
No,
I
no,
guess
no.
I
I know.
guess
I'm kidding.
it's a continuation of that question of how studying graphic design has kind of helped you. Um, how do you kind of think about all of that work?
It's funny. Like starting a design firm when I was pretty young,
Hmm.
and having it be successful and working with accountants and lawyers and having to have a cleaning staff contract and All these
Mm,
things that, run in the background, like the operations of the day-to-day firm, that was really my wheelhouse. I don't know. I just was
mm,
a bit of a natural at the contracts and the operations and
okay.
so with the dean job is very similar. I mean, it's a small school. I think my total budget is a few $1 million a year. Um, and it has very similar feel to me as running a design firm, just in terms of the logistics
Right.
of it.
Right.
So that part wasn't so alien to me. I mean, the other part of your question was, do I like it? And at one of the reasons I did not like running the chopping block was not only did I find the client work not so fulfilling, but supporting that work administratively also was not so fulfilling, right?
Yeah, that's kind of why I was asking that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it makes sense. But the thing about Cooper Union, and as you mentioned, I have it tattooed on my chest, is that it, I mean, I don't have better words for this. I feel like it saved my life.
Mm,
And the idea that it would exist in a way where it couldn't do that for other students
right.
was not okay with me and never will be. And I felt obligated to fight, just like I feel obligated to be the dean in this transition to protect the place. Not that it's under assault anymore, just to shepherd it back to free.
As dean, what do you see your job? You're talking about kind of shepherding it back.
Mm-hmm.
How are you thinking about kind of going about doing that and protecting it and, you know, giving back everything that it has given to you in your role as dean? What does that actually look like?
I mean, a lot of it is trusting the faculty and supporting the faculty so that they can help really guide the school. I really believe the faculty and the students have been the heart of the place.
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
my job as dean, and in terms of, say, the larger vision for the fine arts program, is that it's a collaboration, and a good one, between me and the faculty. Um, so in other words, I don't have to come up with that wholesale. That would be very daunting, right? But
Hmm.
really, just like very systematic review of everything we do since I started, to understand things like, how are our policies hurting the students that those policies need to help, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
how can we introduce more better ideas of fairness? How can we define things like, simple things like, what really is an excused absence, right? those
Right. Yeah.
those things seem tedious, but they add up to a picture of really truly helping the students,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
what I've been working on a lot. The other thing that I'm very invested in is that when I went to Cooper Union, I was really fortunate that one of my roommates at Cooper was an electrical engineer and also like a Macintosh expert.
Mm.
And I had learned how to use like PageMaker and Aldous Freehand in high school.
Nice.
So
Yeah. Me too.
I had a little bit of a touch with that stuff, but John, my roommate, like, he showed me how to use a BBS and download
Mm.
software, and how to, just how Macs work, down all the way
Yeah.
down to like installing RAM.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that led me to be more friendly with the engineers, because there's three schools at Cooper Union: the art school, the architecture school, and the engineering school. And in sort of in that path is where I got into web design and understood how Apache and web servers worked. And
Hmm.
Cooper was one of the first sites to like have Unix as an educational
Mm.
place. So there was a whole culture of the web there. Like, I remember in class looking at Netscape 1.0 or whatever. Um, and that would have never happened if I didn't have this roommate and have this practice. So one of my goals as dean is to bring that more inside so that it doesn't happen so much on the periphery.
Right. Right.
So, I recently worked with my staff, and we got a grant of about $500,000 to introduce new technology into our curriculum, which
Oh,
includes
nice.
equipment and includes artist talks and workshops, and just a way for us to move more into that space. Right.
Hmm.
So one
Hmm.
of my goals is to, bring, let's call it a computation track to the art school, because
Oh, that's
we
interesting.
have a little bit of that now. We have a mostly geared towards HTML and web-based programming language,
Hmm.
but I would like us to do more. Interact with things like laser cutters, CNC machines, virtual reality, drones. I don't
Yeah.
know, blockchain.
Yeah.
There's 100 things where we're not doing that artists are really taking advantage of.
Yeah.
So that my goal is to formalize that a little bit more. And also the engineering school is working on a computer science major.
Mm.
So finding connections to that major into this program in the art school, I think could be really interesting for us.
That leads into that. This perfectly sets up my next question, which kind of leads into my final couple questions for you, because I was kind of curious what you think is next for design education, or like what are the big challenges for both those of us who are teaching graphic design today, but also kind of the students entering the profession. There's so much change happening,
Right.
both in design specifically, but just in the world, that we've kind of touched on throughout this conversation. Where's your interest in kind of the next kind
Yeah.
of part of design education?
I mean, I'll give you like a very basic example to tell you where my head is, which is I'm sure you've seen Netflix.com.
I've heard of it. Sounds familiar.
So the little previews, the thumbnails they use for the shows, right?
Yeah.
Used to be they employed somebody to make those, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now they're
Right.
entirely algorithmically generated, is my
Oh, right,
understanding,
right.
right?
Yeah.
So it's like it understands the location of the face in the photo, it understands where to put the logo, it understands if the logo needs a drop shadow. All those things that we were training students to do, right, are in theory now, at least in this small way, done programmatically, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the big question I have is, when do we start teaching that programming side
Yeah.
as a design tool? And do we do that?
Yeah.
And how do we do that? And for me, this grant is the first way is to bring some of these questions into the classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's not so, it's like we don't, it's not that I want to train them in technology, right? But I want the technology to be seen not as alien,
Right.
as a thing that's just another tool, like picking up a paintbrush or you welding something, or that this should just be part of what's available to you and your ideas. And that's, I want to leave the place when I'm done being dean. I would like to leave that in place for
Yeah.
everybody else. um, and then the other thing, it's not so much about design education, but in terms of my vision for Cooper Union, is that and my talk hits on this a little bit, which is we do a very good job of promoting our graduates who, I don't know, align with our program, right? So, if you're a painter, a sculptor, a graphic designer, we pay a lot of attention to you when you graduate. But we
Mm.
also have graduates like, in my talk, I mentioned the graduate Woody Gelman.
Yeah.
Woody invented Mars Attacks. He drew the original trading cards or the sketches. He invented Wacky Packs, which went on to
Right.
be Garbage Pail Kids, which that sort of side of culture is often not represented
Yeah.
in the way we talk about Cooper Union. And I'm interested in showcasing it and actually bringing light to it, because I want students to know that there's not one path out of art school, that this education sets you up to do all kinds of amazing things, including making Garbage Pail Kids cards.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I mean, I think that that's not even just a Cooper thing. I feel like that's like a lot of higher education, kind of promoting, this is a blanket statement, but you know what I mean? These kind of
Yeah,
narrow kind of views of success. And I'm 100% into this idea of, and even just opening up graphic design, it doesn't just have to be work for clients and, like,
yeah, right.
kind of corporate identity stuff. It can be comics, and all of this stuff can be kind of part of what we do and how we talk about our programs and our work.
I mean, what's really funny in the end for me is that, like, Batman is what led me to be a designer. There's no other way for me
Mm-hmm.
to look at it, really, between the show and the comics and introducing me to that whole world that fueled my path to design. And I went to Cooper Union, I taught at Cooper
Yeah.
Union, I've done all these things at Cooper Union, and I didn't even know that Batman was co-created by a Cooper Union graduate.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how
It's
much we
crazy.
don't talk about our graduates that don't say
Yeah.
do exactly what we teach, right? So it's just, so part of the other thing I'm doing is we don't have a School of Art archive. Like,
Mm.
we don't have something where I can look
Wow.
up and, yeah, it's just like we have bits and pieces here and there. So part of what I'm working on now is actually creating like essentially a very specific art alumni database so we can figure out where
Nice.
people are and where their work is. And so that's part of the things I'm working on too.
That's kind of about, I was just kind of asking about design education
Mm-hmm.
generally and kind of what you see next. I want to flip the question a little bit and like, what's next for you? You have another 3-year term. You mentioned this kind of book
Yeah.
deal, but where's your head right now? What do you think is on the horizon?
It's funny. I'm in love with VR, which is a weird thing. Seems like every time VR comes up, the next thing that comes up is that it's dead, right?
Right,
But
right.
there's something unbelievably immersive about it that intrigues me.
Mm,
I have to think it's part of the future somehow, even though it's like
yeah,
wearing a toaster on your face. You
right,
know,
right.
it's like if they can collapse the technology into a pair of eyeglasses, I think we're going to see probably some horrible things and probably some amazing things at the same time. Um,
As with
yeah,
all
as
new
with all
technology.
technology. I also think like a lot of the designers I talk to now are talking about helping people. And
Mm,
I'm hoping that the pandemic has raised some kind of human awareness in all of us that
yeah.
maybe design should sort of recenter around that notion, maybe.
Hmm. Hmm.
Maybe that's more wishful thinking than a guess at the future. And I think we're in a funny transition with the tools to make design. Like I find InDesign is like gets in my way more than it aids me. And I find like I feel like I'm the last designer on earth who would open Photoshop to make a website. You know what I mean? To the point where no lie, when I worked at Mule Design in San Francisco, they actually like Adobe sent somebody to watch me make websites in Photoshop, like
I
as
love
if
it.
I'm some like extinct animal. Um,
Yeah,
but
you might be the last one. It's
I mean,
true.
look, luckily I don't make websites anymore, so it's all for the best, I think. Um, but the tools are awkward.
Yeah,
They're you know, uh, kudos to everybody who's been going over to Adobe and the other places to help make them better. But I'm craving something more lightweight to make books.
mm-hmm.
Something. I don't need InDesign to also make interactive websites. For
Right,
instance, like
right.
when I did some beta testing for Adobe early in my career, and I remember one of the arguments on the message board was they wanted to add an animation timeline to Illustrator. And I just said, that's like adding a weed whacker on the end of a hammer. Like it just doesn't, there's something about it that doesn't
uh,
compute to me. But they were trying
yeah,
to compete with Flash at the time before
yep,
they had it.
yep,
So I
yeah.
get the motivations, but it's like, I'm surprised that the tools feel like they're almost in the same place as they were when we started.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I can do more stuff with Photoshop than I could in 2.5. Sure. But my basic work in Photoshop, setting type, all that stuff that I used to do in Photoshop
Yeah,
felt mostly unchanged. It's like maybe they gave
yeah.
me the ability to make columns. Thank you. You know. But
Right.
I don't a little ways I don't know what the next thing is. Like I don't want to use Photoshop in VR, for instance.
Yeah.
But I
Right.
don't there is going to be some moment where maybe I can make that choice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know. Maybe I'm rambling. I don't know.
I don't
Um,
know. It's interesting. I mean, I think there's like all sorts of conversations around tools and these kind of startups who are trying to make more
mhm.
lightweight things. It seems like some of them are gaining traction, but Adobe does have a hold on. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But I think you're right. There seems to be a change. We're in a
Yeah.
transition time.
I mean,
Um,
there are lightweight competitors. I mean, what's funny about my past experience is that I spent the summer of 1995 interning at Microsoft.
hmm,
And my main goal was designing the interface for a competitor to Photoshop. And I designed it with Photoshop on a Mac.
of course, that is the best. That is the best story
Yeah. And that
that
should
I've
tell
ever
you
heard.
everything you need to know about how advanced the tools are. You know what I mean? Because that was
Yeah,
1995 and the tools in my opinion, haven't changed all that much, really.
yeah,
Um,
that's hilarious. Um, Anyway, I mean, before we get completely off track, I have one more question for
Sure.
you, which is the last question that I end all these conversations. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
Oh gosh. This is so embarrassing. So
Go for it.
I'm a mega fan of the comic book character, the Punisher.
Okay. You said you talked about that in your talk also.
I do. And I'm a diehard man. I love the guy. It's just, it's, I don't know. It helps me with my anger is the best way to put it. I find it so soothing to read such an angry comic, but that's actually not what I'm reading. There's 37 books, I believe, in a book series called The Executioner,
Okay.
which was basically the inspirational fodder for the Punisher.
Mm. Okay.
Or you could say it was ripped off. Either way, however you want to look at it. But they're
the
like,
Punisher was ripped off by the Executioner.
No,
like
no,
the Executioner came first.
The Executioner came first.
Okay, got it.
And the books are really pulpy, like bad, like think American James Bond books, but not as good.
Okay. Okay.
But there's something about like, you know, every 5 pages there's action that during the pandemic has been just a thrill to read, to be honest.
Yeah.
Don't
be embarrassed.
No. And then the other thing I'm reading, I just cracked it, is there's a brand new biography about Stan Lee that I've been reading.
I was hoping that your answers would be comic related.
I mean, like I read everything. I read all the time, but lately I read to escape. So that's what I've been doing lately is escaping.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you there. Mike, this was such a great conversation. Your love of design and of Cooper Union is infectious. And so thank you for the work that you're doing, and thanks for being on the show. I enjoyed this conversation so much.
Oh man, thank you. I had a great time.
This episode was recorded on March 5th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.